Welcome everybody to the last but not least mini lecture in week 2 of Geography 4880, where we'll explore reactions to geography's quantitative revolution. Last time we saw that in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s, geographers with an interest in economics and urban geography formed themselves under the banner of spatial science and led a quantitative revolution against regional geographers, which were predominant in geography in the 1930s, 40s, and to some extent into the 50s. Remember that the spatial scientists of that time, their calling card was that we should start from measurable facts about the world, about how long it takes to get from point A to point B, about the price of economic goods, the price of land rent, so on and so forth. Make some assumptions rooted in neoclassical economics about how people behave and what they're motivated by. And model out how cities develop, how companies make siting decisions about where to build things, so on and so forth, in order to make predictions about how cities will develop into the future. That really was what the quantitative revolution was at the time. It was a reaction to regional geographers who wanted to just describe Southern Ontario, the US Midwest, as unique entities that consisted of homogeneous kinds of physical attributes, cultural attributes, so on and so forth. But just as the quantitative geographers in the spatial sciences of the quantitative revolution were reacting to regional geographers, by the 1970s or so, we see a group of geographers, many of them former members or proponents of the quantitative revolution, instead rethinking some of it and moving forward more critical and radical notions of what geography is, could be, and the kinds of questions it could ask. They did so at first under the banner of what's known as structuralism. So remember last time we said, there's some real issues with some of these models like central place theory, in that they don't really account for structural, non-observable phenomenon, but nonetheless real phenomena that indeed structure how the world works. So whereas the positivist geographers during the time of the quantitative revolution would have preferred to focus on measurable things like travel time and prices and things like that could just be surveyed. The structuralists said, well, that's not enough. In fact, there are again, these things, these structures, overarching systems and institutions that influence individual behavior, that we need to take a look at. We can't see them, we can't necessarily survey them in the same way, but they nonetheless guide how individuals behave. It's not just how much does gas cost that's going to shape, how I decide to get from point A to point B. It's these other kinds of factors, structural factors. It's not just the price of goods that is going to influence how a city expands over space. Indeed, it is going to be things like rules and laws, language, economic structures. And a lot of this approach, structuralist approach, was strongly influenced by Marx, who said that the most significant determinant of modern social conflict, or indeed modern social development change, was capital's labor relations. That is to say, the fact that there are workers who do not own the means of producing goods and services, and then there are capitalists, those who do own the means of producing goods and services. So a lot of the approach at this time was informed by that kind of thinking. And this led to the emergence of radical geography. geography. Okay, it reflected broader societal and institutional radicalizations at the time. Okay, so at this point, society was changing greatly. World War II was over, um, and all sorts of social movements were on the rise. Feminists were fighting for equal rights and what's known as second wave feminism. Civil movements around the world were fighting against apartheid in the US, South Africa, so on. Okay. And people were rising up in places like France in 1968 to further these social changes. Okay. And this was not something that geography was sort of retreating from in an ivory tower. It was something that many geographers, so certainly not all geographers, were thinking about. That is to say, well, what can geography do to acknowledge these broader social changes and indeed incorporate them into geographic thinking? So these radical geographers or critical geographers were, really taking up criticisms of neoclassical economics and positivist approaches to understanding society that saw society as just, something that we could measure as atomistic bits of facts that were somehow objective and not expressions of bias, certain biases. Okay. And indeed, perhaps the main point here was that radical and critical geographers wanted to not just understand society or just predict how cities might take shape, but indeed to contribute actively to how cities might take shape, to changing unequal conditions within cities, so on and so forth. They really tried to identify and explain inequalities and conflicts that were, very visible in cities at this time in terms of, for instance, capitalist labor relations. So in terms of the concept of social class, for instance. One of the key thinkers here, we'll hear more from him in later weeks, is David Harvey, who you may have, very well-known geographer, still active, who you may have encountered in courses before. So he's an interesting character in that he was a more positivist-oriented, leader of the quantitative revolution in geography in the 60s, but had a very big change of heart in the 1970s or so and took up radical critical geography in the form of Marxist geography. We'll look more at that in a couple weeks. And very shortly thereafter, another sort of thread emerged onto the scene, which became known as post-structuralism. So we go from a very quick emphasis on, well, what are the structures shaping the ways in which cities and landscapes in general take shape, to a focus on the limitations of structuralism and a focus on moving beyond just structure to emphasize individual agency. And agency is something that is not strictly limited to humans, but also animals, and perhaps even objects in our world. Okay, so the idea, one of the main ideas of post-structuralism, emerging in the 80s and 90s, and continuing on into today as a main dominant, main thought system of thinking in geography, okay, was that beings do have individual agency to recognize structures like class, gender, racism, and to act beyond it. Okay, we're not helpless individuals in the face of capitalism. We can actually recognize it and act against it using agency, collective or individual or otherwise. Post-structuralists are very skeptical of the notion that there is a singular reality for everyone. And instead they emphasize that we experience reality differently. Okay, researchers cannot directly access some singular reality out there. Okay, but instead we have to document and describe the different experiences of it, and in particular, different experiences of structures. Okay, people live and work in different spaces, and they experience things like racism, class, and gender differently in intersectional ways. How we experience that is also influenced by not just those structures, but by discourse, imagery, and media. So this is where the postmodern element makes its way in here. I didn't put it on the title of this, but in last week we saw postmodernism and post-structuralism tied together. And indeed, it does fit in here in terms of this timeline, in terms of its emergence within geographic thought as a reaction to structuralism. And so these things, discourses that we see in the media, they also structure, in the sense of govern or discipline, our behavior, and perhaps more so than more formalized structures such as laws. Okay, so this is a very broad overview of some of these more recent or indeed contemporary threads of geography, structuralism and post-structuralism, which are both very visible in the discipline today still. We will be getting into much more detail into how these work and how they play out in terms of specific theories and concepts in the coming weeks. But I need to give you this overview as sort of the the fallout from the quantitative revolution. All right, what it really happened in the fallout of the quantitative revolution was a diversification of theoretical perspective, whether in the form of structuralist thought or post-structuralist thought. We see feminist theory emerge, post-colonial theory emerge, cultural geographies or new cultural geographies. This also led to diversification research methods. So no longer was the emphasis on, we just need to count things in order to understand them and model them and make predictions. The emphasis was instead on, it was made known that there are other kinds of valid ways of research out there. Obviously, quantification is still important in geography, but what those reacting to the quantitative revolution of the 60s and 70s said was, there are other ways that we can do research. We can do qualitative descriptive methods, just as the regional geographers did. We can do participant observation, do interviews, life histories, discourse analysis. These are all valid forms of knowledge. In order to recognize the very valid life experiences out there in the world that were made aware to us by feminist movements, by civil rights movements, and so on. Post-colonial or anti-colonial movements of 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so what we get at this point in geography, and this is contemporary, 21st century geography, as we get a lot of these old themes and fields and topics emerging. So, we take a concern with urban and economic geography, we throw in the new emphasis on culture, and we get what's known as the new economic geography, okay, which we might talk a little bit about later, which accounts for some of these, different assumptions about how individuals behave in modeling economic patterns and behaviors and the ways in which cities develop over space. We get, resource geography, a combination of human environment considerations with that regional rural geography that we discussed previously, okay, and so on and so forth. We'll be looking at these in the coming weeks. We might find ourselves now, as in, in 2020, 2022, in the midst of the second quantitative revolution in geography, where new forms of location and geospatial data are lending themselves to a resurgence of positivist kinds of ways of researching space and place. Okay, whether it's from taking big data gleaned from cell phones in order to, assess patterns in COVID-19 distribution and to predict its unfolding into the future. A very much kind of positivist approach to the question of COVID-19, very focused on measurement of empirical facts that are presumably objective, and that where just the measurement of those facts is what's important and not necessarily the, we don't start from a theory, we start from the facts, all right? We see this in part, this second quantitative revolution, in part because there's a lot of money to be made. With the rise of location data, the kinds of data that our phones are collecting every day about us, there is a lot of money to be made, and geographers recognize this, and in many ways, some of them are playing up that in the discipline's ability to analyze that data in order to gain legitimacy, recognition, credibility for geography. So they are saying to companies like Google and all the different kinds of apps that are out there, and so on, governments out there, they're saying, look, we are the science of location. We provide location intelligence. Give us your data and we can help you analyze it. Okay, so in this way, it is echoing the first quantitative revolution, which sought to define geography as a science, and in particular, a science of space. All right. However, there are skeptics of the second quantitative revolution we find ourselves within, and these skeptics have roots in some of those reactions to the first quantitative revolution. Okay, they continue to carry through some of those threads around feminist geography and critical approaches to structures, and are making the critiques of the second quantitative revolution. And we'll look at them as key thinkers right now. This is a thing this is an activity we're gonna do over the coming weeks, is look at key thinkers in contemporary geography as a way to illustrate some key thought. The goal here is to expose you to geographers that have been writing key works in human geography from about the 1980s onwards, show you how those thinkers apply philosophies and concepts and methods in their research, show you that there are still ongoing debates amongst geographers, and this is background knowledge that you can apply on the take-home exam. And these two key thinkers that we're going to look at today, they think of space as something we can get at in spatial science, and in particular in spatial science tools, geomatics tools like GIS, but they do not think of space as absolute space, kind of XY, Cartesian grid, lat long coordinates, the kind of isotropic field that we saw with von Thunen, Kristall, or central place theory in the first quantitative revolution. So they've learned from the first quantitative revolution and reactions to it. They see GIS as an important tool, but not an objective one like positivists might. Our first contemporary geographic thinker is Mei-Po Kwan, who is professor of geography at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, although she previously was department chair at the University of Illinois, Ohio State University, got her PhD at the University of California. Her focus is on understanding how socioeconomic differences, again, note that emphasis here on differences and different experiences, how they shape mobility and understanding of built environments and cities. So she uses the tools of GIS, as we'll see, and is a spatial scientist, but her questions are not, how do cities unfold across space? And her models are not, space is an absolute container that we can just fill with things, and her assumptions are not people are just rational actors who only consider things like costs and price. Okay, she starts from somewhere else, which recognizes that people are different. They're different along these sociological lines, socioeconomic lines, such as gender, income, race, ethnicity, religion, and that shapes their experiences of space. So what we see here is some innovative work she did in the early 2000s on space-time modeling. So actually taking surveys from people, in this case, women on the left employed full-time, and on the right, women employed part-time, and charting out their movements in space at different times. So just to give you an example, what we see here on the left is that women who are working full-time, the sort of densest movement that they have during the day is maybe, during, it's very close to home, but, later at night. And they do have they are able to get away from home, at different parts of the day, as shown on the x-axis there. Whereas women employed part-time do tend to stick closer to home for one reason or the other. Okay, so what she's doing here is employing tools of GIS to understand not just mankind in general, but indeed to look at differences amongst people in an intersectional kind of way. So not just looking at how women's experience and use of space might differ from men's, but indeed looking at different kinds of women, in this case based on class status or employment status. Here's another very innovative paper she did in the early 2000s. What we see here is actually a very old version of ArcGIS called ArcView, and one element of it, ArcScene, where she, after 9/11 in the US, surveyed Muslim women to understand their experiences of fear and hatred in urban environments following 9/11 and Americans' reactions to it. Okay, so this is a qualitative and quantitative study she did to understand not, sort of how 9/11 might change the development of cities, but people's experiences of it. And what we're seeing here is, different buildings are colored different ways based on her survey respondents' experiences of those spaces. And the squiggly line there is actually a 3D chart of how this one particular Muslim woman, moved throughout space and time, and maybe avoided certain spaces, and so on. And indeed, Dr. Kwan has written about the second quantitative revolution, but is optimistic that we've learned lessons from the first quantitative revolution, and instead we can use quantitative tools to advocate for social change. We can use quantitative tools combined with the social theory we've learned from structuralists and post-structuralists to advocate for continued social change. And that's a key theme of our second key thinker, Renee Sieber. Dr. Sieber is an associate professor at McGill. He's written much on the societal context of GIS, open spatial data, and the GeoWeb. So her questions here are really, what can spatial data technologies offer civil society and social movement groups? And not just that in terms of more instrumental uses of GIS, how can we use GIS for social change? But what is the social context of GIS? And how does it shape society? How is location data changing the economics of everyday life and political economics at a broader scale? It's really important stuff in terms of how location data is billion, if not trillion-dollar asset and commodity right now. So here's one way of looking at it. She's interested in the two-way relationship between GIS and society. Whereas the first quantitative revolution folks would have been just interested in using GIS or other geomatics tools at the time to understand society. She's interested in, well, how can we actually change GIS to better society itself? And how can we understand that, again, the ways in which things like location data are shaping society? So in the first vein, she's interested in rewiring GIS for social change. How can we do things like make public and participatory geographic information systems instead of expert-led geographic information systems? How can non-governmental organizations, grassroots groups, community-based organizations get hold of GIS, and how can we change the software itself at a fundamental level to work for those groups? She worries, like other academics, that GIS can embody a mechanism for misrepresentation, diversion control, surveillance of people. And so she calls for a GIS2 that can represent different measures and visions of place, integrate local knowledge, support cultural and multilingual distinctions, okay, and preserve rather than reduce frictions, disagreements, redundancies, errors. Very much in line with what we saw from Dr. Kwan in terms of illustrating changing GIS and going beyond its sort of default settings to show how it could be used to critically understand and improve society. One of the things she's worked on is what's known as the GeoWeb, which refers to the democratization of geomatics using volunteer geographic information. So, if you go to OpenStreetMap and add your own edits, maybe during a humanitarian disaster, that's the GeoWeb, and that's providing open data for the GeoWeb. So she's done a lot of research on that. More theoretically, she's tried to understand the relationship between governments and citizens in an era of proliferating data and spatial data in particular. There are different models here in terms of just government publishing data all the way to citizens being more actively involved in sending data to the government in order to inform planning. And she's been a real critical observer of things like Sidewalk Labs' Toronto Quayside proposal, where Google, in the form of its parent company Alphabet and partner entity Sidewalk Labs, wanted to transform the Toronto waterfront or part of it into a living data lab, to collect all sorts of data on people and processes happening in that part of the city in order to optimize the running of that neighborhood. So she's been real critical of efforts to take that kind of location data on you and me and everything else, put it in the hands of companies and governments, critical of that surveillance effort. So we've come to the end of this last and somewhat long, and I apologize for that, final discussion. We've looked at some key thinkers, and here are some prompts for you to consider in summarizing your thoughts on this week. Take care.